start to hunker down again.
Yeah. All right, we might get started now. Welcome everyone who's joined us this morning for the latest webinar on engaging school leaders and teachers in the design and use of innovative learning environments. I'm Nick Danicic, the education marketing sector lead from GMA Engineers and also an electrical engineer. I'll be hosting the webinar today where we're very fortunate to have our guest, Associate Professor Wesley Imms from the University of Melbourne. Hi and welcome, Wesley. I'm sure that today's webinar will be really insightful for all of us who work in the design and development of projects for the education sector. Learning environments certainly been changing pretty rapidly in the recent years, and I think a lot more change to come, particularly in response to the increased need for remote learning due to the pandemic. Before we get started, a couple of logistic items. Firstly, we are recording the webinar, and we will send this to everyone who's registered over the next day or two, so keep an eye out for that. The webinar is intended to be interactive, so at any point, if you have any questions along the way, or there's topics of interest that you want us to go into a bit more detail, please use the Q&A function that you'll find at the bottom of your screens. Don't use the chat function, so just use the Q&A function. And I'll be moderating these throughout and putting them to Wesley as we go. And we'll also have time for questions at the end. So now let me introduce Wesley. Wesley is an associate professor in the Melbourne Graduate School of Education. He's that school's head of visual art and design education and its research domain coordinator for curriculum and teaching. He provides research leadership through his secondment to the Learning Environments Applied Research Network, which is industry and academic collaboration founded by the university's faculties of education, architecture, and medicine. Wesley is the project lead investigator for the Innovative Learning Environments and Teaching Change ARC Linkage Project, as well as a program lead for the Plan to Pedagogy research program, and its insights from these research programs that Wesley will primarily be sharing with us today. With everything that's happening in Melbourne right now, combined with Wesley and his teams working hard to transition all of his courses online, we're very fortunate that Wesley has been able to give us some very valuable time today. So welcome to Wesley, and I'll let you take it from here.
Thanks very much, Nick, and thank you for the introduction, and thanks, Catherine, for organising this, and thank you to people for turning up. Nick, do we have screen share? Am I on screen now?
You're on screen now, so yeah.
And you see my my slides?
Not yet, no.
No, hang on, I'll just go screen share, excuse me, just a sec. No, not sure if I can do it from my end, can I, Nick?
Yeah, so at the bottom there should be share screen.
Okay, just a sec, I'll have to get out of that, into that. Just while I'm quickly sorting it out, actually I don't think I can, Nick. For some reason the Zoom has disappeared, the page, the critical page. Excuse us just while we get this organised, people, because I do need to see this.
Yeah, so there should be a tab at the bottom.
Yeah, I've only got my I don't have a Zoom thing. It was there a minute ago, wasn't it? Just a sec.
Maybe if you hover your mouse down the bottom.
Yeah, I don't actually have a Zoom homepage. All I'm seeing at the moment is my own slides. Just excuse me just a second.
Oh, you're right.
Okay, there we go. Now I found it. My apologies, everyone. So Nick, you just need to enable me to screen share. It says the host has disabled it. So you just need to say, yeah, allow screen sharing. And then we'll be fine.
Okay, try it now.
There we go. See now?
Yep, perfect.
Good. Can you see a picture of Marist College, Bendigo?
No, it might be your other screen.
Okay.
If you've, yeah, that's the one. Perfect.
So just let me, still there, still Maris College, or still the other one?
Yeah, Maris College. Yep.
Okay, that's good. But my apologies to that, people. My background is as a teacher. I'm an educator. That I have been really lucky to work for quite a while with architects, faculty back in a collaborative research endeavour called Learning Environments Applied Research Network. And look, we've got that loose mandate of trying to make most of the spaces, no matter where they are, whether it's schools, hospitals, wherever. And we've done research for many years around that notion of making these spaces actually really zing and work. So it's really good to be able to speak to the diversity of people here today in the webinar, because educators are a funny lot, and maybe architects the same, in that, you know, certainly for educators, we think that educators are the only people who can solve the problems that education is facing. Whereas our philosophy within our group is it's a collaborative experience, it's a cross-disciplinary thing, and that all of the players in developing and providing schools have got a strong voice in helping to make these spaces actually work. So I just wondered, you know, these sorts of spaces that actually we're playing around with, and some of these images are showing some gorgeous places that have been built, and certainly different to the schools that we went to as kids. But I suppose one thing to start off with, just for the fun of it, is to look at this. Here's Abel's beautiful spaces in Melbourne, and yet this is from, you know, 150 years ago, and it was the old school sort of scenario that came out. And I suppose, just for the fun of it, if we do this and flip from one to the other, you suddenly realise that a lot of the qualities that we have in our modern environments aren't necessarily all that new, that we have had them for quite a while. Here's collaborative teaching happening, peer-based learning with the kid at the front, cross-disciplinary, you've got music, you've got geography, you've got art, you've got the young people helping the students helping even younger students to ask questions and deliver, etc. So that notion that we're doing something brand new has to be put aside. What we're doing is we're trying to refine and make better a situation that's existed for a while. So in these sorts of spaces, we have that query, you know, what is that actually works? What is that actually is helping kids ultimately to learn better, because that's the ultimate need of these particular places. So I suppose we start off with looking at the need that actually exists. And excuse me, I'm just going to jump through a whole bunch of slides and just talk to the ones that I think perhaps of most interest to our group. And it's important for us to look and say, the reason why we're doing this is not just to revitalise and make prettier the learning spaces that our kids are going into, is to actually meet a very, very important need. This is something that's come out of the US, and it's just one example of a whole bunch of data around this notion of why we're actually moving towards the sorts of spaces that we have at the moment, what we're expecting them to do, the performance that we're expecting from them. This shows that actually over the last 40 or 50 years, the type of graduates emerging from the spaces that we're building and putting into place are changing. The needs for the employers of those people is different. The whole notion of the routine and the manual type skills, which were very prevalent, of course, with production line and all that sort of thing, have been dropping away dramatically. And the non-routine and the interpersonal skills are now becoming the sought-after quality that employers want in this sort of modern age. An example of that in one specific case would be this notion of mathematics skills. Businesses that are employing people who have need a high level of mathematics, they are looking at different types of people to emerge from it. So again, you know, 40 years ago, the idea was that people who worked in areas where mathematics skills were important were employing people who were good at maths. That was just logical. But actually, the difference now has come that the ideal person is somebody in today's day and age who has high maths skills and high social skills. And the person with low maths skills and low social skills, that hasn't changed. What has changed those two middle lines? That actually, interestingly now, employers would prefer to employ somebody in a mass-orientated type occupation who have low mass high social skills compared to high mass and low social skills. In other words, they want these sorts of qualities in the students that are coming out of the schools, that we go from now working at desks and clicking away and working very independently to a much more collaborative and communicative, creative and critical thinking type of graduate is needed in today's day and age. So that sort of says this is the mandate then that these spaces have to try to address. This is what we have to try to provide for. So a way of looking at it in education, at least, is this whole idea that is the critical thing that we want from kids. So the difference between superficial and deep learning, I'm sorry, I'm giving you a sort of fairly quick tutorial.
Right.
On the other hand, stuff you probably all know really well. And Nick has been told to interrupt me with questions from the field, from people out there, just to stop me ranting and raving on. So please feel free to add a question and I'm happy to address it as we go. But the deep skills notion is superficial and deep learning. Superficial learning is the type of learning that kids in schools do to pass an exam, basically. That you swat for an exam, you sit the exam, you get a good mark and then you move on. Deep learning is where you learn the material, but then you apply it to the real day setting that sparks your curiosity. You make links to your own personal beliefs and understanding, etc. A good example of that was some studies that came out of the US a while back, where their equivalent of grade 12 students who marked the highest in their particular exams, in let's say mathematics, or an area like that at least, were given the same exam 12 months later and they all failed it. The reason being that material just didn't stick because they weren't using it and they weren't putting it into applications. Deep learning is where that's what happens. So this whole notion of deep learning is one of the characteristics we want the spaces that we're working on at the moment to be able to facilitate in kids. So that whole idea of an environment we're building, we call them innovative, but it's not that they're innovative in terms they're different and brand new. We've already looked at that and seen that actually these spaces really have existed for quite a while to some degree. It's actually the practices that happen within them. That innovative space is actually an environment, is the place that's built, that is both the design and the practices that happen within, help to make it an innovative outcomes for the students. Because ultimately, every cent we spend on these schools is aimed at one thing, that's improving the learning outcome from kids. So, just move to another set of expand that a little bit further, if I may. The ILETC project, sorry, I'll just get the right slide. It's actually a large project, $2 million run over 4 years, funded by the Australian Research Council and a whole bunch of partner organisations. So we got together to try to address this issue of how do we get these spaces so they're actually working well. And one of the critical things in that process is the teachers, because one thing educational research agrees on, above and beyond anything else, is the teachers are the number one influencing factor on students' learning outcomes. In other words, a good teacher is the most critical factor in terms of kids having good learning experiences. So how do we get teachers to use these spaces really well? When we look at these spaces, we realise that while they're of interest and they're nice, they have been designed for the purpose of helping teachers to be able to engage students in a variety of ways, because no two students actually learn the same. We've looked at these. And so the job that we've been given to us through the project we're working on at the moment is to come up with evidence about the degree to which these spaces are actually working or not working, and in particular focus on helping teachers to be able to utilise that. One of the companies that we're actually sharing with is Ecofon. Ecofon is an acoustics firm, and the group we're based with, Ecofon, is from Sweden. here's an example of the way that the design and the acoustical treatment of a space makes a difference to the effectiveness of the space. And it's a mapping of sound transmission based on colour, with the hot colours obviously being high levels of sound and the green colours being low levels of sound. So the areas like that are very quiet if this is the source of the sound. And as you move through, you can see that actually the sounds are dissipated quickly. And the sort of work that Ecofon does shows that, for instance, where you can see just there, the staggering of a door, even though there's no doors in place, because a lot of these environments would like to have them more open. By staggering the doors like that, they're actually creating a buffer effect without literally putting a door on or without putting a solid wall in. That's a glass wall there, and that's a low level barrier. Yeah, go, Nick.
Sorry, we're getting a bit of audio distortion on your end. Would you be possible to turn your video off for a short period just to see if we can improve that audio?
Yeah. Right, I'll try that.
Yeah, thanks, mate.
I've got to find out where it was. Yeah, there we go.
Audio distortion.
Yeah, audio just that's fixed. So it's quite, Nick, it's quite appropriate you pull that up while I'm talking about acoustics, because it's the sort of issue that the kids actually have in front of them over a period of time. Let me jump to something a little bit different. Let's look at some of the evidence around that. So if this is,
and so when you're talking before about how the teachers are the, I guess, number one influence, are they, in your research, is that sort of the primary of who you're talking to and trying to get some insights from and getting some input from them as to what, I guess, makes a good teaching space for them?
The teachers are the focus, but the sources we go to are varied. So yes, we are certainly asking teachers and principals, clearly, who help to manage teachers in schools. And I'll pull up some of the evidence on that in just a second, but it's fascinating that teachers have got a very high level of understanding of actually what works and what doesn't work. It's something that we haven't actually given enough credit to over a period of time. So we will do surveys. We've done observations of teachers. In fact, the last thing I will show you will be a study that we've done, which has actually even been run by teachers, looking at teachers working in these spaces. I think it's a critical thing that we have to understand that teachers are highly skilled at working out what works and what doesn't work. What's often lacking is the whole notion of the vocabulary around design and the inferences around things like acoustics. If you ask a teacher what are the qualities of acoustics, they will say they're either good or bad, and there's nothing can be done about it, as opposed to Ecofon's philosophy and what we've been working through this project is that teachers actually, if they're taught a few basic things, can make manipulations within their environment to make the space work better. Here's another example of the sorts of stuff that happens when you start asking teachers what's going on. Fiona Young is an architect from Hayball in Sydney. She's doing a PhD within this project. One of her sub-studies was to go into a school, into spaces, different types of spaces, with an architect who designed the space and with teachers who work in the space, and ask them, what are some of the affordances in this place? So in other words, what are some of the things that exist in the design of this space that helps us use, teach well? And there's two things that came from this little study that she did. If you look at the bar graph, then you will see that on the left, you've got traditional schools, site 1 and 2, and the next 3 are what we call innovative spaces. They're the ones that are much more open, the ones that have more flexibility, movable walls, more innovative furniture, etc. So the first thing you can see from this, there are far less affordances, there are far less opportunities for things to be used in order to teach and teach well in the more traditional setting than there are in these spaces that we're providing at the moment. The second thing you will notice is actually the difference between the blue and the orange columns. So the perceived affordances, the things that people walking through and saying, yep, I could use that to teach X and Y, I could use that, or etc. In every case, the teachers identified a higher level of affordances than the architects. So in other words, the people who use the spaces are recognising more opportunities to use the space to teach than the people who designed the spaces, which in itself helps us to highlight the fact that that the teachers themselves are a fairly critical part of trying to understand what's actually happening. This is another study that's been done by one of our PhDs. Dan is looking at deep learning, which we spoke about a little while ago, and also about those qualities of teaching that have been found through research to have high impact in terms of students learning well. And he's compared it between traditional and innovative learning environments. And what he's found is that the more innovative spaces that are being provided for by architects and all the different companies that are now building these spaces, those more innovative spaces have higher levels of deep learning occurring, which is the quality that arguably we're after, and higher levels of the quality, high quality teaching outputs that actually are required of these spaces. So it's one of the first studies that actually is starting to identify the fact that these spaces do actually make a difference, that some of those qualities we're after in terms of educational outcomes are actually being achieved. I'll give you another example of that. This one comes from work done by, excuse me, work done by a colleague in Queensland at Churchy Grammar. So Terry Byers did 4 years of study for a PhD with us. And through a bunch of different methods, Terry was able to come up with some fascinating findings. So the methods are what we call a repeat measures design, where you have the same measure applied over a period of time, and then you change the situation to see whether the measures change. And the change in the situations here was moving the students from a highly innovative space to a very traditional setting. And in effect, what Terry, and summarising down a huge amount of work, high quality work, Terry was able to show that actually in the more innovative spaces, that there was in maths and English, or in a larger study, English, humanities and English, the difference between 17 or 11 and 17% in terms of learning outcomes. So on standardised measures, students are doing better in the more innovative spaces. It's not often that somebody has been able to sort of isolate space as actually being a factor in terms of learning outcomes. And Terry's one of the few people who's managed to do it. Dan, as we just mentioned a minute ago, is becoming another who's working in that area. But now this is the more interesting stuff in some ways, because while there is a difference in actual learning outcomes, and again, thinking back to where we started today, where we were talking about the whole idea that we are requiring different skills from graduates, arguably, now than we were 20 or 30 years ago. Those areas were around collaboration, critical thinking, creativity, etc. Terry's study that he did following on from those with a much larger cohort in a particular building that they started, Terry was able to identify at least 3 situations where there was a statistically significant difference, improvement in some particular measures in the more innovative spaces. So creative measures are up, collaboration and mentoring were all significantly different in the more innovative space than they were in the more traditional type spaces. So, feel free, Nick, to interrupt me if you need to. I'm just quickly running through some of the evidences that we actually have found. This is a fairly major output or outcome from the ILETC project, where we surveyed nearly 1,000 schools. And we asked principals to give their impression, first of all, of what type of spaces exist, because actually nobody knows how many of these more innovative spaces exist or what they really look like. That they're often done.
So when you talk about these innovative spaces, I guess, what are you using to define that as? Like, is it that flexibility that you're talking about with teachers? Is there a few key things that, I guess, is the hallmark of what you would call an innovative space?
Yeah.
As opposed to traditional,
and I think most of the people in the webinar would be familiar with, the more innovative spaces. They've been around now for a while. But this diagram gives you a bit of an idea. On the right, what you can see is what we call our typologies, the design typologies. And if you look on the left, you have type A, which is the very traditional, which is what at the moment, a good number, in fact, according to our survey here, we have about 3/4 of the schools in Australia and New Zealand at the moment, this is primary and high schools, what we'd call the more traditional type setting, which is type A and type B, which is either a centrally loaded corridor, just with classrooms off either side, or maybe with some sort of common space outside those classrooms. But the answering your question, the more innovative spaces are C, D and E, where there's more flexibility. You know, C is where you've still got those classrooms and that breakout space, but you've also got walls that can be moved to make larger classrooms, and increasingly open, I suppose you would call it, as you move across to type E. In fact, type E would be what people call open plan.
Yep.
And I think one of the things that this survey is useful for is it shows that actually it's not a polarised opposite. And a lot of the conversation is there still, where people say it's either a traditional classroom or it's open plan. Actually, the survey shows there's a range of hybrid designs in between those two extremes. And it's in this notion here that we start to say these are the types of designs that are leading to the sorts of practices we're talking about and we're measuring. It's interesting, you know, it took us up until this project for us to start to get a sense of, across Australia and New Zealand, how many of these spaces exist and what they look like, because we didn't really know. And we then also found out what sort of teaching and learning is happening in those spaces. And we gave the teachers, again, another typology that we designed, which is the traditional, where you've got kids sitting facing the front with the teacher teaching from the front. Much the same, only the kids are at those round tables and desks that are fairly common at the moment. Right through at the other extreme, where the teacher becomes less and less visible, right through at the extreme of the kid working by themselves without teachers' input. So that's our topologies 1 to 6, and you can see again that the majority of the spaces actually are being taken up by these typologies here. So even though we're doing well in Australia in terms of providing these more innovative spaces, the reality is 3/4 of children at this very moment, well, not because of COVID, but 3/4 of children are sitting in classrooms facing the front and listening to a teacher teach to them, which is not necessarily conducive to that whole idea of developing kids who are creative in the way they think, because the notion of creativity and collaborative learning in this scenario is very difficult. This sort of thing is more prone to it, etc. So, you know, we've got 3/4 of the kids actually still being taught in spaces that aren't necessarily in keeping with our aims of what we're aiming for in terms of 21st century learning. But we use that data to actually go through and do a measure. So if you look at it this way, up the y-axis, we have deep learning, and we talked about that a minute ago, and the bottom end, 2.6, would be a low rating, and that would be kids just learning for the sake of an exam. To the top end, 3.2, which would be kids actually applying the learning to their own setting, etc., those qualities we talked about a minute ago. And across the bottom are those notions, and I've only touched on them, we won't go further because we don't have time, but it's those notions, these are the types of teaching that have proven through studies to have high impact in terms of student learning outcomes. And we've then mapped that against the types that we got from our survey. And we were very surprised to see such a clear-cut delineation happening. It's not causality. You can't say one causes the other, but there is a correlation that's happening here. And that is that we're finding that more and more students, that there is a definite trend in high levels of deep learning, which we're after, and high levels of teachers using those qualities of teaching that are seen as being high impact. There's a high correlation of that with these more innovative spaces. And corresponding the other way around as well, if you look down here, you'll see that the more traditional classrooms are correlating with superficial learning and teacher-centred approaches.
And Wes, with that, did you get, I guess, good feedback as well from teachers about, I guess, teaching in those spaces, as like they felt they could, teach better? Obviously, the results showing there are saying that, look, the kids are benefiting from it, but in terms of the teachers as well, do they prefer that type of approach, or do they find it more challenging, less challenging?
Now, just so people know, Nick and I didn't script this, but that question is, here we are here. We did another survey to 1,500 teachers this time, so it's an even larger sample. And the first thing we asked them, which space they taught in. And interestingly, a reasonable number of those teachers have had some experience teaching in the more innovative type spaces. But in answer to your question, Nick, the next few questions sort of address that. So these are teachers who are responding, and they're saying that the places that support my teaching, and you can see that the traditional classroom doesn't rate all that well, but neither does the totally open plan. The interesting part for us is that notion transition. How long does it take teachers to move into these spaces and teach well? Because while we as an industry design and provide these types of more innovative spaces, the criticism has often been that we then just pass the keys over to teachers and expect them to teach differently, and they don't. Arguably, teachers still teach the way they used to, being successful, which is the more traditional. But contrary to that, this survey showed that teachers are saying that actually it only takes about 6 months to become comfortable teaching in any space. It doesn't matter whether it's traditional or open plan, that they're highly adaptable. The interesting one was this statistic that showed that actually only 11% of people, teachers, preferred the more traditional classrooms, and the majority prefer these more open plan classrooms or the more flexible spaces. And in terms of this is your question, was getting support and help to move into them. Teachers are struggling because while they say it only takes 6 months to get comfortable, you have to ask the question of what are we as an industry doing or as an educational sector doing to help teachers to actually move into these spaces. And it's a little bit depressing when you look at the 14 items we have identified through our research as being the qualities that teachers say are needed to be able to move into these spaces well, like time for planning, developing curriculum relevant to those spaces, participating in the design of these spaces and being part of the thinking around that, etc. They're the 14 characteristics that teachers say they need to be able to use the space as well. And there's not many of those spaces down here where actually they're getting significant help in doing that. And the ones that rate the highest, whoops, thought I had another slide. The ones that rate the highest are areas like leadership, that principals are and leadership groups are giving teachers good support. But the areas that really rating lowly are the school organisational structure itself. So while designers are doing a great job of providing, and builders are doing a great job providing these spaces for kids, and teachers are moving in and trying to work in them well, the reality is the structure of the school, things like timetabling, the predominance of exams in grade 11 and 12, and those sorts of issues are stopping the spaces from working well. Teachers are not getting much support in how to adapt the space to suit those sorts of things. So it's a little bit of an idea of some of the data we're coming up with, Nick. So let's take a break for a second. Are there any questions out there that we can address while I pull something else up that might be worth looking at?
Not at the moment, but I'll open up to anyone who's listening and has any questions come in.
It's a little bit hard talking to an audience you don't see.
Yeah.
How about if I talk about one specific case then? Because that ILETC project is a big project and it's doing a lot of work in terms of trying to get data around these types of spaces we're building, how they're being used. But the reality is we know for a fact that actually every school is totally different, that no two schools will approach it the same way. In fact, we know that even no two teachers really will approach moving into these spaces and using them well, will do that in the same way. So what we did was just developed up a second project, which we call Plans to Pedagogy. And it's a little bit different in that we actually work intensively with one school and the teachers in that school. At the moment, we've got about 11 classrooms or 11 schools participating in that project. And they're very widely dispersed from Christchurch and Auckland in New Zealand through to Perth, up to Cairns, etc. The idea of it is to actually start using teachers themselves to help us to identify what the problems are and for us to use sort of our research skills and our knowledge that we've developed over the years to help teachers design up projects that help them use the spaces better. And for that reason, it's been interesting to realise that across the 12 schools, the diversity of issues that teachers raise. They go from everything from the design process. We're about to employ an architect. How do we go about doing that? How do we engage with the architect? How do we get the school vision that we have translated into actual spaces that can help us to fulfil that vision? Through to issues to do with, we have recalcitrant children who don't turn up to school. How can these spaces be helped to improve attendance records, etc.? So across the 12 schools, each school has got a different issue they want to address. And the one that I would probably want to talk about just for a minute would be one in Western Australia, which is a primary school south of Perth near Margaret River. It's an oldish school, it's been around for a while, well-established school, but as you can see from the pictures here, part of it is a fairly conservative new build, and also the ubiquitous relocatables, because it is a fast-growing area. But the issue that they wanted to address was the whole idea of furniture. We've often been asked if we were going to spend money on improving our school, where's the best place to spend the money? And one of the answers we often get teachers and schools to look at is the whole idea of furniture being something that you can buy, put in, take away, etc. And the school had been doing that for quite a while with a company called Northern Neville, who has sponsored VAS's development of experimentation around different types of furniture, etc. So we teamed up with them and with a colleague, Dr. Morris from Edith Cowan University, to look at this whole notion of engagement. To what degree does the type of furniture being used in these spaces impact students' engagement in learning and in their school experience? And of course, part of that, again, has to be the teachers. Do the teaching styles change according to the types of furniture that we would have in them? So we did a fairly unusual thing with this school, because you can't often do this, but because of the Plans to Pedagogy project, we had the facility to be able to do with it. So Plans to Pedagogy runs usually across 3 years, so you have time. And the idea is that we develop a small, what we call spatial learning team within the school. And that's 3 or 4 teachers who take on the project as their own. Some of them are doing a master's or even a PhD as part of that process. But really, when it comes down to it, it's about helping teachers develop up good research approaches in order to solve a problem in the school that's got a spatial component to it. So the furniture was the focus that VAS wanted, because they'd already been doing for years, playing around with Northern Neville furniture, and they felt like it was making a difference, but they had no idea whether it really was or wasn't. The design we used is what's called a, I'll skip through this because it might be boring for people, but for us it's fascinating. But a single subject research design is where you have one measure that you apply over time. But what you do is you do the measure, but then you have an intervention, you have a change, keep the same measure going, and then you go back to the first one again, and then you go to the second one again. If you get a pattern that's shown here, the differences between those lines indicate, particularly the gap between the last and the first, indicate there is an effect happening, something is occurring. So with that single subject research design was one of many ways that we actually ran this project. And we did it through what's called a withdrawal design. So the school has got the majority of the classrooms are what you'd call more innovative in terms of more open plan, etc., more flexible furniture. And we asked the teachers, do you mind for one term that we then turn your classroom back to what you would call being a traditional use of furniture? And this over here is their interpretation of what a traditional type of furniture was. So the basic tables and chairs in the basic clusters, etc., probably of those typologies I showed you before, it'd be typology 2 or something like that. So that's the difference between the two. And we went and withdrew, changed their furniture for a term, kept the same measures going, but then we gave them back their tradition, their original innovative space again, and kept the measures going again. And over a period of time, we did those measures. We also looked at a whole bunch of other things. We looked at the type of teaching that's happening within the space. So we had an observational metric that allows us to have people observe the teachers and say what they were doing. And we had interviews with teachers. We had the students doing photo elicitation and those sorts of things. And we ended up coming up with a final product after a year and a half of research that's in this report, which is freely available. It's on the web, and it looks at the whole idea of that project and what we did and comes up with the findings. And I'll skip to some of the findings down here because it's of interest, not so much in terms of furniture and furniture production, but interest in terms of how we can build some evidence around what we do as industries and trying to work out whether it's being effective or not. The long and the short of it is, and I'll skip through to some of the sort of the findings here.
And with that, I guess one of the questions to come through, has research findings from the ILETC project been published, and can people access it?
Yeah, look, there's an extensive amount of information, Nick. So all people need to do is go into the search engine and put in ILETC, the initials, and they'll come up with our website. And the website has got dozens of technical reports, fact sheets, teachers' workshops. It's got survey findings. It's got publications if you're interested in reading those things. Everything we've done is actually on that website, and it's all freely available. Our partner organisations have been extremely generous because they fund the project together with the Australian Research Council, and they're very happy for the public to have access to the information. So go to that website and find that material. There's 4 years worth of information there available to people. Yeah. Look, we found in this particular school that in the more traditional settings, and again, that it was more, it was less student-centred and it was more teacher-centred, which is not surprising, I suppose. If you've got students sort of facing the front listening to a teacher, then it tends to be the teacher takes control, which again is one of those characteristics. If you think back to that early graphs I showed you about the needs, it's one of those things that that we're trying to avoid. We want the students to be sort of more involved, I suppose, in the direction of their learning, etc. The type of pedagogies that are actually being provided are interesting because if you find that in the more traditional setting, there's more direct instruction, there's less interactive instruction happening. You find that there's actually less facilitating happening in the more traditional setting, and the feedback is down, but class discussion is up. The questioning is down. So it gives you a bit of a sense of the type of pedagogies and how they change by changing the types of furniture that are actually in those spaces. Same goes to learning activities, and the assessment is really a furphy because we didn't have time to do a proper look at the assessment over the period of time we had. But much more time is spent in the ILEs and actually applying learning and applying ideas. And there's description analysis and creativity, etc., are a funny one, and we're still trying to unpack why that is up in terms of the traditional setting compared to the more traditional, the more innovative furniture. But here you can see that the learning communities that kids build within the classrooms and the teachers are able to build is in the more traditional sorts of furniture. The individual work is down, the small group work is down, but the whole class is up. And which again, it's just data that tends to show that actually the reality is what we're finding is the assumptions are actually quite correct, that in the types of spaces where kids face the front, it's more teacher-centred, and there's less creativity and there's less of that collaborative sort of work happening. The other part that this report shows is in the idea of engagement. The fascinating thing was we found no difference in engagement levels of the students, whether they were working with traditional classroom furniture or the more innovative. And we spent a lot of time looking through that data and then also using the teacher interview data. And what we actually found was there is what's called a persistence of engagement in that school, that even though the furniture was taken away, the kids were so well schooled and so well looked after that the engagement level stayed high. But what did change was in the more innovative space and the more traditional furniture settings, the teachers were highly stressed. They had to work extremely hard to keep the kids engaged in a more traditional furniture layout than they would in the more innovative furniture layout. So, I mean, that's a set of findings that come from a particular study within Plans to Pedagogy looking at one particular thing. But I suppose the reason why we wanted to raise in this webinar is we're talking to industries who are investing a lot of time and effort into providing the types of environments that we talked about at the start.
And Wes, that leads into another question from Tara. So she's spoken about how she's worked extensively in primary schools to design collaborative spaces, which teachers had been supporting, but they changed principals, and the new principal wants to make the classrooms traditional and go back to those kind of spaces. As consultants, I guess, how can we help the new principal, or I guess get engagement from some of these groups to start incorporating these innovative and collaborative spaces? What would your advice be?
I think obviously there's a mindset there that actually the traditional setting provides what's needed, and it's a matter of then addressing that mindset and saying, well, is that accurate or not? And I'd say to Tara, evidence, like we're talking about here, the whole thrust of today's talk is this notion that if we build evidence, we start to understand the situation better. The evidence is starting to show that the more innovative spaces are providing the sorts of outputs that society is saying they need from the students. But there's always truth in different things. So one of the studies that we did showed that here's the slide here, and this was very rough data analysis that Terry did quickly for us, and we never followed through on it because the funding ran out for this particular component. But what it shows though is NAPLAN results for grades 3 and 5 were higher, better NAPLAN results in the more traditional settings than in the more innovative. So if your school and your teachers and your school vision views as extremely important NAPLAN results, that is standardised testing on basic literacy measures, then there is an argument to be made that it's possible the more traditional setting with the teacher-directed teaching, etc., will get those better results. But we already knew that. We already know from the other surveys we've done that deep learning, which is actually then students, utilising that knowledge and applying it elsewhere, improves in the more innovative spaces. So for Tara, it's a matter of saying, well, what is our school vision? Do we want kids who are creative, collaborative, critical thinkers, or do we want students who can sit an exam well? Yeah. And this little bit of data, which again isn't official, it's nothing more than just a preliminary look at data. But if this is actually accurate, it can be found to be true across a bigger study, then it's horses for courses. If you want good results, maybe the more traditional setting is correct. Yeah.
And have you seen, I guess, more of an uptake or consideration for these, I guess, innovative spaces, like across the public or private sector? Have you seen, I guess, it taken up more in one or the other, or is there a difference between the two that you've seen?
There's no data on it per se. Certainly our observations for years of working in these types of spaces suggests that there's more of an uptake in innovative spaces in the private sector. A large part of that is to do with finances. That's not cheap to build these spaces. And the other part is, to be blunt, that private schools are businesses and they have to sell what they have to get customers, so to speak. It's put bluntly, but that's the nature of it. And an innovative space looks good. But it's that matter of finding that blend, because people do walk through the schools and have a look and say, I would like my child to be there with all of these really fantastic looking spaces. But they also, part of their head, say that, would my child learn there and do well there? And that's where private schools have a difficult road to tread, because they want to be innovative and be shown to be leading the field in terms of creative and forward-thinking pedagogies. But they also want to show that they can meet those basic expectations of the core competencies, that we can cover that. So there tends to be, in answer to your question, there tends to be more work being done in private settings in terms of design exploration. But having said that, education departments have poured billions of dollars into more innovative spaces over the last 10 or 15 years. So they're not holding back. If you look at places like New South Wales, and Victoria in particular, Queensland to some degree, Western Australia nowhere near as much, but those particular states are putting a lot of work and a lot of exploration into these more innovative spaces and trying to make them work. So yeah, it's I think that statistics show with a quarter of the spaces now what we call innovative, that there is a trend towards these. The data also shows us that with our population growth, we have to provide in Australia 2,000 new classrooms a year for the next decade just to meet that population growth. And a reasonable amount of those spaces now are more types C, D and E on our typology, the more innovative spaces.
Yep.
Yeah. So that's the direction we're going, Nick. Yeah.
Yeah, and it'd be good to see, I guess, especially with some of the Department of Education, all those sort of guidelines and stuff that are probably pushing a few of those designs. They get pushed more in that direction of being more flexible and innovative. You'll probably see a bit more intake in some of the public schools as well.
Yeah, and look, it'd be worth it if we could give even better evidence that actually, these spaces are doing. It's no good just having a wish list and saying, this is a fad at the moment. They look pretty, they're nice. You know, we need to have evidence to say, actually, they are going the direction that our country wants our graduates to go.
Yeah. And while we're on, I guess, the topic of COVID and everything else, how do you think that might have impacted on all of this and everything else going on with schools, having that access to remote learning and changes like that? Like, what's your take on things in the future of, how COVID might affect things?
There's going to be a wealth of data coming out soon from researchers looking at the impact of COVID on children's schooling. And until that data comes out, obviously it's difficult to say anything other than just personal opinion.
Yeah.
I mean, clearly COVID is going to make a difference to the way people view schooling. You've already heard a lot of people talk about the increased respect for teaching and teachers. That if it's this difficult for me to keep my 2 children at home focused, what's it like with a classroom of 30? Yeah. So that sort of thing will probably change a bit. I think the idea of you can learn anywhere is going to be an interesting thing. That I know from my own anecdotal experiences with parents that they lament the fact their children are not getting the range of experiences, both in terms of social interaction at home during COVID, but also in terms of facilities, that it's not possible to do half the things that they should really be doing in terms of some of the specialist subjects, and in particular through that whole notion of collaborative learning with peers. So it will change it for sure. I think there's wishful thinking that, actually now we're going to see much more of it in the future. I don't know if that's going to be the case. And I think probably what we're going to be looking at within the field that we're talking about today is the degree to which COVID has taught us valuable lessons about the quality of the environment as well as the actual facilities themselves. So we just need to wait and see what research comes out of it. We're not being showered with money to do follow-up research on this, so maybe nothing will come out of it other than just anecdotal. Yeah.
Is there any more questions out there from people? Getting close to 11, so if you've got any questions, by all means, put them through now. Now's the chance.
So, Nick, your organisation represents, brings together a really wide range of different industries within this webinar.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm interested in the degree to which you feel that there is some sort of cohesive, cross-disciplinary sort of attitude towards these environments and building these sorts of spaces. Or is it really just everyone just looks after themselves and they occasionally get together? How much collaboration does actually work?
I think there is a fair bit of collaboration, but I think it stems through what the school wants to do, obviously, and then directing it through the architects, which we get a plan and then bring together other consultants and services on that vision. And that's, I guess, that earlier input between the architect and the schools and getting that buy-in of, what they're looking for and what they're trying to achieve with the spaces in the school and the vision, like you were talking about. You know, that deeper learning as opposed to just getting some NAPLAN results. So that earlier collaboration is one that I think probably needs a bit of get some light, and I think that education to the schools is probably a key bit of that.
And I think one of the things we've found consistently working with many schools is schools themselves need some training in this process. That, often the design of a school falls to the principal and the lead teacher in terms of collaboration with architects or with firms. And we often will tell a school when we go to work with them that you've probably got a year's worth of work before a professional turns up, a design professional turns up. You have to get your own act in gear in terms of what is the vision for our school? What is it we're trying to achieve? And to what degree, what sort of spaces do we actually really need? How many of them, and size and scale and that sort of thing. How do we actually imagine teaching happening within these spaces and learning happening within these spaces? All of that thinking needs to be done before they start working with architects and with design professionals, so that they at least speaking with some background context and are speaking with sort of an idea of what the end point is to be. Yeah, so I think that's one of the perennial problems we have. We say that teachers don't move into these spaces very well. Now data is showing they do, but what actually happens is they don't tend to get much support in moving into the spaces, that we rely a lot on their professional integrity. And there are a lot of teachers who say, why would I change what I'm already doing if it's already still working, as opposed to what's the potential of these spaces, what sort of teaching and learning can happen. And that's sort of the area, I think, where there's a lot of work still to be done. Yeah.
We've got a question from Renee. Is there any ongoing research planned on your end?
There's a lot of interest in continuing. ILETC finishes end of this year. In fact, technically it's finished in June, but we're on the skeleton crew now doing the final reports and the writing up through to December. There are isolated bits of research happening in terms of consultancies and those sorts of work. There's an ARC that our group has just started, so it's another large-scale project on building schools as community hubs, and that's being developed by my colleague Ben Cleveland in architecture. And we are writing up at the moment a follow-on project to this one, but it takes about 12 months for it to go through the system. So we're looking at a 12-month hiatus where we will probably form partnerships with industry partners and get a project started based on partner money before the ARC, if we are successful with the ARC, before they bring in cash to be able to increase the size of the project. But having said that, it is a depressing thing that if we spend, $30 million on a brand new school, there'll be no money in that allocated to actually researching what is it we're after and how do we know whether it works, the evaluation of the impact of it, and what's been learned before in terms of learning outcomes from particular spaces, other than good teachers doing the sorts of things that your colleagues are asking, where's the information on this and that. So it ought to be that a certain percentage of each build is allocated to that notion of evaluation, preemptive evaluation beforehand, what has worked well, through to long-term inhabitation evaluation. We've been in this room building now for 5 years. Is it living up to the educational vision that we set for it? And it's the hardest message to get across to the broad field, is that actually these schools, everything about them exists for one reason only, and that is quality learning experiences for students. It's not the quality of the build, it's not how fancy it looks, those sorts of things. It's simply about the quality of learning for kids. And until we learn how to evaluate that, we'll continue to blunder around to some degree. Yeah.
Cool. Well, I think we're getting on 11. I might just do a bit of a wrap up, but then Wes has offered to hang around for a few more questions after if people would like. But yeah, thanks so much, Wes, for taking the time to join us this morning and sharing your extensive experience and insights. If any of you would like to reach out to Wes directly with any questions, we'll include his contact details in the email when we send out the recording. We'll also include the links for what you were talking about earlier, with all your findings and research. We hope attending the webinar today has been of real value, and we will be running more webinars in the future on interesting topics related to buildings and design. So please keep up to date and make sure you're following DMA on LinkedIn. Keep an eye on your inboxes for a recording of the webinar, which will come through in the next 24 hours. So thanks for attending. Thanks again, Wes.
It was a pleasure, Nick. And yeah, these days and times, it's interesting doing webinars. Yeah. it's a good way of sharing knowledge for sure, but it's difficult to, yeah.
I did have one question, I guess more services based. In some of those findings with those rooms, is there any impact from the services that you think helped, whether it be, I guess, talking on our end, whether it's, lighting, aircon, communications, so comms backbone and things like that? Was there anything like that you would think definitely helped, or you saw an improvement in those spaces?
Look, there is some good evidence around about indoor environment quality in particular, in terms of learning outcomes. So Barrett in the UK has done two quite large projects that both are quite definitive in saying that the more innovative spaces, but also the quality of the spaces, has a direct correlation to students' experiences. Attendance is up, learning outcomes are up, etc. in those types of spaces. There's also been quite a steady stream of research out of the United States for a number of years that have focused on the quality of the school environment in terms of things like attendance and, again, learning outcomes and those sorts of things. So, if people want to look into it, they could find a reasonable amount of evidence to show that actually if we build better schools, we will get better results simply from the services, simply from the quality of the build. And again, it comes down to getting that evidence and using it. Yeah,
because obviously, now there's more of a push to more the vertical schools, with space being such a premium, as opposed to some of those traditional horizontal, low-rise buildings. Whereas now, you're seeing some pretty large vertical schools going up.
I've not seen any evidence, Nick, to show that actually a particular genre of design is better for kids learning and teachers teaching.
Yep.
Whether it's a vertical school, whether it's like Dandenong, which is satellite schools all on one campus, great huge schools, things like that. There's no data to show that actually any one genre is better than another.
Okay.
In fact, our plans to pedagogy schools show that, that the 11 schools in that particular project range from very high socioeconomic, very wealthy private schools through to some of the poorest schools around. And, when it comes down to it, it is the quality of the teaching and the quality of the leadership that makes a huge difference. But as we found from VAS with the furniture, teachers have to work so much harder in a poor environment to keep those levels of engagement up.
Yeah.
So if we can do things like provide better designed schools, better quality furniture, more flexibility, more options for teachers, then that has a direct correlation to the quality of learning, which again is the only reason why these places exist.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. No. Well, I think that's all. We don't have any more questions. So thanks a lot for your time, Wes. This has been great. And thanks everyone for tuning in.
Look, that's good, and I think Catherine has sent through a request for some of the materials and slides and things like that. If people want to email me, I can have a conversation with them about material, because the slides I showed you were a fairly hodgepodge collection of stuff, and there's much more directed information available through different websites, so I can deal directly with that. So I'm happy for my email to go out to some of your attendees.
Awesome.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you for looking after us.
No worries. Thanks a lot. Stay safe down there.
We will, and you too. Bye-bye.
Yes.